I make every effort I can to not only explain and update you about what's happening in the economy in a serious way, but I do try to make it interesting and entertaining. I do not deny it or hide from it. My experience, having been in the economics field all my life, is that very few of the people in my profession have the faintest idea how to do that. And the profession suffers. Not that it hasn't got other reasons that it ought to suffer, but it suffers in this case from a method of delivery that is horrific and that is reproduced in graduate education. So I try real hard not to do that. So if you notice that, that's an intentional effort. Partly to make news that might otherwise be depressing a little more exciting and interesting, and partly to show you that there's a certain pleasure in understanding what's happening to you, even if it's frightening at the same time. There's always been an association of fright and pleasure, which is why everybody goes to horror movies in the way that Americans love to do. Okay, so let's begin. I want to begin with one of the people I most enjoy saying things about, Larry Summers. Some of you know Larry Summers, Lawrence Summers. I shouldn't be impolite. He was the person in line to become the next head of the Federal Reserve here in the United States, to replace at the end of this year Ben Bernanke, who has been the head of the Federal Reserve for a long time. The problem with Larry Summers is that he talks too much and in the wrong circumstances, in the wrong way, to the wrong people. And you can't keep doing that without it coming back to bite you. And in this case, what bit him was an accumulation of people who hate him and who made it clear to the president that he could not possibly nominate this fellow, while Obama made it quite clear he wanted to. The final thing that made it impossible was Mr. Summers, having been given the job of president of Harvard University a few years ago, gave one of his off-the-cuff speeches in which he basically explained that the reason there were relatively few women in high positions as professors in the biology, chemistry, and physics department was, and I don't remember the exact words, but something to the effect that women lack the capacity, the capability, something very smart for the head of a university to say, and it got the predictable results, and he was out of there. He was fired by Harvard. Harvard wouldn't fire him because you don't do that at Harvard. You just throw your person away and you fudge a lot of language and you hope no one pays attention. And if you're Harvard, mostly people don't. And so he disappeared from that job. But that again made him less than desirable to half the population, so sort of. So it didn't go well, and so he lost out. He lost out. And in his place, a woman economist named Janet Yellen, who was already on the Federal Reserve, is the person who Obama nominated, and she will become the head of the Federal Reserve in the new year. Janet Yellen and I were classmates. Really? Yes, we went to Yale University at about the same time, 2 years apart. We had the same teachers and the same education in the same courses. And we knew one another a little. There were very few women in the graduate program of economics in those days, so the rest of us noticed that there was a difference. And, well, in the economics graduate programs, a lot of those kinds of differences go unnoticed until many years later. She was, at the time, as we all were in that university, what would now be called Keynesian economists. We were taught macroeconomics by the same professor, a man named James Tobin, T-O-B-I-N, who later got a Nobel Prize in economics. He was my teacher of macroeconomics, and he was Janet Yellen's teacher of macroeconomics, and she emerged, like I did, as pretty much Keynesians. That is, people who believe that capitalism is a system that has serious systemic flaws, including tendencies to blow up, to have major catastrophes like the Great Depression, which is what produced Keynes in the first place, and that the only way that capitalism will survive, let alone be effective and desirable for a population, is if there is systematic government monitoring and systematic government intervention in the economy. And we were taught by Mr. Tobin, Professor Tobin, why and how the government needs to intervene. Monetary policy of the sort that the Federal Reserve is responsible for, fiscal policy of the sort that the Congress and the President are responsible for, in the way of tax policy and government spending and all of that. That's what we were taught. That's what we learned, and that's what we basically believed, given the way we were educated. Mr. Tobin was a pretty good teacher, unlike most of ours there. He was a pretty good teacher. And one of the things that made his class pleasurable is that he occasionally told a joke. And almost all of the jokes had as the butt of the joke a funny man who taught economics at Chicago, but who was really silly. And his name was Milton Friedman. And Professor Tobin would make jokes, and as all good graduate students do, we all laughed. And we learned to enjoy this humor as we developed, and so did Janet Yellen. But then the wind changed. Not that many years after she and I went through Yale, the wind changed, and Mr. Friedman occupied the position of authority in the United States that Mr. Tobin used to. And Mr. Tobin never recovered, by the way. He stopped teaching the course, he was upset, and he basically withdrew from the department even before he officially retired. And Mr. Tobin was no longer in the limelight. And many of his students adjusted. I believe that's the technical term. Caved in would be another way, but adjusted and went with the wind, which, if you work in Washington, is the only way to go. Otherwise, you're not in Washington very long. And they went with the wind, and Mrs. Yellen basically did so, although I believe she probably retains a little bit of that Keynesianism and will be less difficult as a partner for Mr. Obama than Mr. Bernanke was, and so she's a good choice for him. Clearly, however, the people who came out of Yale didn't all go in that direction. There were some who ended up like Milton Friedman, there were some who ended up like Janet Yellen, and then there were a few who ended up like me, who didn't like capitalism and who found that the more they taught us how it worked, the more reason we had to be looking askance at the whole system. But it is an interesting story of how careers diverged. Back to Larry Summers. When he was in the running, it was necessary for him, as it has been and will be for Mrs. Yellen, by the way, she's married to another economics graduate student named George Akerlof, that some of you may know, who's also a famous economist at Berkeley. When Larry Summers was in the running, he had to say the things that one has to say. Then last week, at a meeting of the International Monetary Fund, Larry Summers gave a speech. He's not in the running anymore, and so it was a different Larry, and I'm going to just quote you a couple of the things that he said about the recovery. I'm quoting now. This is from the New York Times of November 9th, reporting on the meeting in Washington of the International Monetary Fund. Quote, "My lesson from this crisis is, my overarching lesson is that it's not over until it is over, and that is surely not right now." That's a nice way of saying no recovery. In case you have any doubt, he went on. "There's no evidence of growth that is restoring equilibrium." Whoa. No evidence of growth. That's what a recovery would be, evidence of growth. And there's no equilibrium, which means not only are we not growing, but we're not even stable where we are, which isn't a good place. "One has to be concerned about I'm quoting, one has to be concerned about a policy agenda that is doing less with monetary policy than has been done before, doing less with fiscal policy than has been done before, and that is taking steps now whose basic purpose is to cause there to be less lending, borrowing, and inflated asset prices than was before." That's about as depressing a prognosis of where we are as an official economist could articulate. The language is stilted. As I told you, it's not a profession that knows how to communicate real well, but the message is clear. If you're not in the limelight, you can begin to tell it a little bit like it is. There is no recovery in this economic system, and there hasn't been for 6 years now. This crisis begins in December, officially, of 2007. We're 1 month shy of 6 years. There is nothing that this man can see now that he's allowed to say the things he doesn't say otherwise. On the other hand, when I say there's no recovery for most people, I've got to always be careful. There is recovery for some. Stock market's doing pretty well. Profits of large corporations are doing pretty well. The incomes of people who own shares in the stock market, they're doing pretty well. But for most people, no. But for those who have, it is good times, and I thought I'd give you a good feeling by mentioning one to you. This week, at Christie's International Auction in Geneva, I'm sure this is an event few of you miss, a Rolex Daytona chronograph sold for a record $1.1 million for a watch that keeps time pretty well. It's called a Paul Newman Daytona watch. Is this because Paul Newman owned it? No. It's like one that Paul Newman owned. And there were relatively few of these made in the 1970s, so now it is known as a Paul Newman type Daytona watch, made in the 1970s, and that sold for $1.1 million. The price was the highest for a Daytona at public auction. Christie's also sold a Rolex Daytona, not made in the likeness of Paul Newman, but a special Rolex Daytona that had been originally made for the Sultan of Oman. And that sold last week for $864,285. So you may not be able to go to such auctions, but somebody is. Also last week, also at Christie's and at Sotheby's, there were major auctions, and I wanted to share with you the good news that comes from that. Christie's used the word, I'm reading again from Bloomberg, Christie's used the word masterpiece 3 times in the first 3 paragraphs of its catalog, promoting a Francis Bacon triptych that it is auctioning off, the triptych, 3 little panels of a painting, for $85 million. And they're very excited because it tops Sotheby's' recent sale of Edvard Munch's 1895 pastel of his famous painting, The Scream, that some of you know, which Sotheby's sold for $80 million. I want to read you some quotes from some of the excited managers of the auction houses. We are so excited. I didn't make this up. We are so excited because this week the sellers include seasoned collectors like the musician Eric Clapton, the hedge fund billionaire Stephen A. Cohen. For those of you that pay attention, he's been in the press the last few weeks because the government has found him to have done funny things that are illegal with lots of money. But I just want you to know he has another side. And also the newsprint magnate Peter M. Brandt. Sotheby's' Tobias Meyer, principal auctioneer, said, if these sales do well, it means that there is an enormous amount of cash around. See that? Even without going to economics, you can grasp the key sort of thing that's going on here. Whoa. Last thing. Mr. Brett Gorvey, Mr. Meyer's counterpart at Christie's, called the confluence of high-priced works this season as proof of, quote, the confidence in the art market at a time when there is great purchasing power. You may not have great purchasing power, but somebody does. If you grasp that, then you understand who's recovered and who hasn't in this economic system. Moving right along. Something interesting has been going on the last few weeks. We've mentioned it, but I wanted to bring some of it more to your attention. We have had a movement. It's a little haphazard, but it is happening. It's a movement on the part of retail workers and fast food workers, people who typically get at or close to the minimum wage and who work for things like McDonald's, Walmart, and all of that. And they have been going on strikes, and they have been picketing in front of their stores in various states, sometimes coordinated here in New York, California, and so on. And it's beginning to have an effect. And I wanted to show you a little bit about that and then drive home the lesson. What are some of the effects? Well, first, let me give you the results of the poll. Gallup poll reports that 80% of Americans, randomly polled over the last few weeks, 80% favor raising the minimum wage. In some cases, the poll is for $1 an hour, from the current $7.25 up to $8.25. Some want to go even further, higher, but it's an overwhelming majority of Americans favor this. And that seems to have been, from everything I can tell, the reason why President Obama did something interesting. First, in his State of the Union message back in January, he advocated a minimum wage of $9 an hour, up from $7.25. By the way, $7.25 is the federal minimum wage. There are a number of states that have higher minimum wages. For example, Washington and Oregon typically have the highest in the country. They already have more than $9 an hour minimum wage. But for the president to say for the federal to move it up, that was remarkable. And then last week, Mr. Obama did something even more remarkable. He said he changed his mind. He now wants the minimum wage to be $10 an hour, not $9. So he moved it up another buck from where he thought it ought to be back in January. Now that could be because he rethought the question. But a better guess would be that he sees the polls and he sees the action in the society and he can see where it's going and where he has some support. But in order to put this in perspective, two things I wanted to bring to your attention about this. First, it's very easy to adjust the minimum wage because remember, it's a dollar amount, $7.25 an hour. You can ask the question, gee, what was it 5 years ago, 10 years ago? And if you do that, you would have to adjust to what were the prices people had to pay, so you had a sense of what we would call the real minimum wage. In other words, you get a sense of what the minimum wage allowed you to buy, okay? The minimum wage hit its highest level since its inception. The minimum wage happened in the 1930s. So it hasn't been around that long. But the highest it ever got, adjusted for prices, was in 1968, when it reached, if you adjusted for prices, on a level that today would be about $10.50. In 1968. So here we are, over 40 years later, and a daring president is proposing that it be put at a level less than what it was 40 years ago. That may be counting as courageous in somebody's book, but you have to have a little bit of perspective. $10 an hour would mean we're still not where we were in terms of what we give a worker at the minimum wage. Even though that worker is working harder today, working more productively with more equipment and better equipment, is much more productive than he or she could have been 40 years ago. So they're producing more and more per hour of their labor. But what they're actually getting is $7.25 which is very low compared to what they got in real purchasing power back in 1968. So we've seen a decline for 40 years in the minimum wage. Nice way to treat the people at the bottom of society. Does every society do this? No. No. So I thought I'd give you the best, latest statistics I could find to compare minimum wages in other countries. And the latest data come from the year 2011. So they're 2 years out of date, but it's the best I could do. Federal minimum wage, that is countrywide minimum wage. United States, $7.25 an hour. I'm now going to read you a list of countries that pay more. And I'm going to tell you how much they paid, so you have a sense of it. United States again, 2011, $7.25 an hour for the lowest paid workers. And I'm going to start with those closest to the United States and then keep going higher and higher. So you see how some countries pay their workers. Japan, in 2011, paid its workers $9.16 rather than $7.25. Minimum wage workers in Japan get a third more than the United States. In UK, $9.57. In Canada, this is all adjusted to US equivalent, US dollars. Canada, $9.76. Canada, close to $10, and we pay our minimum wage $7.25. New Zealand, $10.22. The Netherlands, $11.38. Belgium, $11.92. Ireland, $12.03. France, $12.55. Luxembourg, $14.21. And at the top of the pile, Australia, $15.75 an hour. All those countries managed to pay their minimum wage workers way more than we do. And the last time I looked, none of them has fallen apart. None of them is in as bad shape as we are. Gee, maybe there isn't the relationship between raising the minimum wage and destroying your society the way people suggest. And the American people, with their voting and their polling, seem to show it. Some of you may have noticed that in the elections just a couple weeks ago, was a pretty solid victory for Governor Christie across the river there in New Jersey. But on the ballot in New Jersey was a raising of the minimum wage for the voters to vote. There had been an attempt to raise the minimum wage in New Jersey last year, and it was vetoed by Governor Christie. And during his race, he denounced any proposal as threatening the well-being of New Jersey. The proposal to raise the minimum wage won overwhelmingly in New Jersey. The same people who voted for Christie voted against him on that subject, and the minimum wage is raised in New Jersey, I think by about $1 an hour. It's not a very high raise, but it shows again that if there were anything remotely like a democratic decision about what you pay at the bottom, that would be a much higher amount of money than we actually pay here. Mr. de Blasio, the new mayor here in New York, is on record advocating a minimum wage of $11.75. So we shall see where that goes. Okay, next item before we get to our major ones. I haven't the time, and I know many of you know about it, to talk about Obamacare and the pretty ugly disaster that has come to be. Here's what I just want to hammer home as a way of understanding it. It's a little bit like what I began with today. If you remember when I said about Janet Yellen and Keynesian economics, James Tobin and the people who trained our generation believed that the government had to intervene to make capitalism work well. And they were opposed by the conservatives, the mainliners, the neoclassicals, they're called in economics, who believe that the best role for the government is to disappear. There's nothing new. You don't need the Tea Party to get this perspective. It's very old debate. The Obamacare is a compromise between those who wanted to keep the government out and those who felt the government had to come in this case, to manage the health dimensions of our economic system. The sad thing is it got caught up in that process of quote-unquote compromise, which means that you do not interfere anywhere near enough in the private part of it to really make a difference, and that tends then to undermine the bit of interference from the government that you do institute, and makes it very messy and confused, which is what you see. And what you see across the board, because that's what we have. We have a politics in which there's an endless oscillation, a little more government, a little less, but never really resolving this question. And so you have an unsteady compromise in which the two sides try to undermine each other at every turn. You can see that now, obviously, in our politics. But it shows up in the Obamacare because it can't solve the problem. It can't give up on private doctors, private hospitals, private drug and medical device makers, and private medical insurers, the private medical industrial complex, if you like. It can't give up on that. And yet it has to have the government come in because we have millions and millions of people without health insurance. We have very poor medical results in this country. We spend a wild amount of money. Again, just to remind you, we spend more as a percentage of our per capita than any other country. Nobody else gets close. Whereas our results are mediocre. They're in the middle of the pack. Many countries have longevity, live longer than we do. Many countries have a better result in terms of the number of newborns that live to the first year and all the other standard measures that the medical community uses. So we get mediocre results and we pay more than twice what anybody else pays. If this were any other industry, if it didn't have a stranglehold on the media and so on, this is an unsustainable situation and intolerable, but it survives. And because there's no resolution of it, we get one half-baked measure after another. We are the only advanced industrial country that does not have a nationally organized medical insurance program. So when I read you that list of people, countries, all of whom pay much higher minimum wages than we do, remember that not only do those low-income workers get a much higher minimum wage, but they also have all their medical bills covered. Okay, last thing. Every now and then I allow myself, and I try not to be mean-spirited about it, to say something about Paul Krugman. But his last two pieces I found amazing. And here's why. He writes these pieces. I assume many of you see his work in the New York Times or elsewhere. He writes a column every few days. And it's reprinted very widely. And he talks about his frustration with the American economic situation, the lack of real recovery. He's good about that. The crazy policy of the government, which is against getting us out of this mess. He's good about that too. But he constantly talks about we. We have a confused policy. We have a counter-effective approach. We don't understand. And he makes it out as though it's like, well, let me read to you. There's a bitter, I'm quoting, there's a bitter irony because one main reason we've done so little about unemployment is the preaching of the deficit scolds, those who have wrapped themselves in the mantle of long-run responsibility. We've done ourselves immense long-term damage. Mr. Krugman needs to believe that there's a we here, all of us together. We confront the fact that some of us have a bad set of ideas. This is a professor. People haven't learned it properly. And he's giving a stern lecture to those silly people, the ones who get a D on the exam. You didn't get it. Here's how it actually is. And he's very annoyed, having won a Nobel Prize, that everybody isn't keeling over in gratitude for him having cleared up their confused D-level exam. But the problem is that Mr. Krugman's ideas, classic Keynesianism, government should intervene, government should borrow money, government should stimulate the economy, all of that. Shouldn't be cutting back on expenditure, you should be increasing, all of that. What Mr. Krugman doesn't seem to want to face is that the problem isn't the idea. The problem never was the idea. The problem is whether, it's awful when you can't turn it off, right? What? It's all right, it's all right. It's all right. The problem isn't an idea. So let me remind you again of the history. In the 1930s, we had a terrible depression. And the same Keynesian ideas, that's when they erupted, were common then. The government should intervene. Remember? Roosevelt did that. He intervened with Social Security. He intervened with unemployment compensation. He intervened with a federal jobs program that hired millions of unemployed people. He created the first minimum wage. He passed a law allowing trade unions to represent workers. He did extraordinary things. Is that because he had the idea that Mr. Krugman wants us to get? No. Having the idea is the least of it. Having the political force to get the idea dealt with, that's the trick. Ideas are easy. Lots of us have real good ideas. But we go to our deaths with these good ideas because we haven't got the organized power to realize them. What happened in the 1930s wasn't good ideas for Mr. Keynes and others. They were there, and I don't want to take away from what Keynes achieved. Certainly was a great economist. But what made the difference in the 1930s was organized mass power. The powerful Communist Party, two powerful socialist parties, and the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, organizing millions of people into tightly organized institutions, unions, and political parties that carefully collaborated while fending off the police, the government, the army, all of that. Maybe difficult and awkward to face, but that's the reality. That is the reality. Mr. Roosevelt changed his mind. He found persuasive the very ideas that he hadn't found persuasive 2 years earlier. But what intervened was mass organized power. And what frustrates Mr. Krugman right now, and what he apparently doesn't see, is that he can spin out his good ideas, and many of them are, and his good criticisms. And he can continue to feel as frustrated as I would imagine many of you do, because there isn't an organized political power to translate those ideas into real historical force. And as long as we don't do that, the we in his mind is going to continue to exist. I'm going to come back to that we in a couple of minutes. All right. Let me turn now to the three major things I want to talk to you about. We won't have time to do them all, so I'm going to do mainly two of them. First is this issue of austerity politics, which is what I want to talk about because it comes right out of the we of Mr. Krugman. Then a little bit about state and local changes in our economy that are really very, very important and not well understood. And then about our tax structure, another topic which is perennially on people's minds and which I want, if I can, to try to clarify in one overview. So let's start with this issue of austerity. we have to go back and understand that there is a basic two-step approach that all capitalist countries took, all of them, in the wake of this enormous crisis that broke upon our world system in 2007. When things began to collapse, when the mass purchasing power of our people was not enough to buy things, when the level of indebtedness that had been accumulated by individuals, businesses, and governments was too great to pay for, and everything crashed across the year 2008, it became very clear across the world, from Iceland to Argentina, from Pakistan to New York, and everywhere in between, that we were in one hell of a mess. We hadn't seen anything like that. We had seen episodic breaks, but not a collapse across the world like this. In fact, it very quickly became clear to those who pay attention that we were looking at the 1930s all over again, and that's still possible. But it was really scary, particularly the last 4 months of 2008. And if you lived in New York City at that time, and you went to the movies and stopped in a restaurant, you were living in a peculiar bubble, because a few blocks away from you, people were having meetings at the Federal Reserve building in downtown, including people I know personally, who were having discussions about what to do when it all collapsed. And they weren't having discussions about a big collapse in the future. They were having discussions about a big collapse next Monday. Okay? There's always this disconnect. I remember being so moved when I read this book by an American journalist who was in Moscow and Leningrad at St. Petersburg at the time of the Russian Revolution in 1917. An American reporter named John Reed, who then wrote a book called 10 Days That Shook the World, became a movie later. He was the, what do you say, lover of Louise Bryant, some of you know, important woman in American feminine history and so forth. He described the Russian elite in their coaches on the way to the opera, being completely unaware that the soldiers and the farmers that they were passing in the street were on their way to make sure that when the opera was over, they didn't have a home to go back to. They had no idea. They were going to see, you know, the opera, Boris Godunov for the 800th time, but not aware of what was happening. And that was New York, because it really was falling apart here. So in step one, every government did the same thing. The government met, said, the economy is about to collapse, we can't have that, because we will go with it, everything will fall apart. So we're going to throw every bit of money we can either beg, borrow, print, or steal in order to solve this problem. And basically, they couldn't tax folks because that would have sparked a revolt. They couldn't just print the money because that would have made everybody in the world extremely nervous. For example, how do you print dollars if the whole world holds dollars? If you print too many of them, then they become worthless. Then you're holding something that's worthless. This is not a possible policy. So the only thing that was left, borrow the money. And so every government started borrowing money like there was no tomorrow. Very important that you keep that in your mind. They borrowed. What could have been the alternative? What could governments have done to get into their hands all the money that they needed to throw at the banks, throw at the big corporations, to keep the economy going, stimulate the economy, all the things they needed to do to keep it going? There was one alternative to borrowing it. They could have gone to the rich people and the corporations and taxed them. That would have raised the money. You know how we know that would have raised the money? Because when they didn't do that, and they chose instead to borrow, they borrowed from the same people the money that they hadn't taxed from them. Let me make sure you get this. The government has a choice. It can tax corporations and the rich, or it can borrow from them. Guess which the corporation and the rich prefer? Good. Now you understand the policy. That's why, by the way, if the government had taxed corporations and the rich, it would have had the money to stimulate the economy and save the banks, and it would have run no deficit. Wouldn't have to borrow anything, would you? Come on, this is not complicated. Why do we have a deficit? Because the government borrowed from the people it chose not to tax, which is the only reason they had any money to lend to the government. If this sounds like a setup, good. You haven't had to go to graduate school, you still understand it. Most of the people go to graduate school, still don't get this. You will never see this in Mr. Krugman's column. He knows, but you won't see it there. It doesn't show up. So in step one, you borrow a ton of money to save a collapsing capitalism. Step two, you're now accumulating debt. And the corporations and the rich are now worried. They're worried about two things. They've gone through the first hurdle. They brought the system to crisis. It hasn't cost them anything. Not only do they bring it to crisis, they get to make a loan to the government to deal with the crisis they made, and they're paid interest for the loan to help the government solve the crisis they did. You got to love a system that works like this. But they get nervous because they're smart and they understand, whoa, let's see now, well, government has a lot of debt, but we hold the debt. We're the ones who lend to them. We got to make sure that they pay off to us. And we got to make sure that the way they pay off to us doesn't involve them taxing us to get the money to pay us off, which of course the government could do. If there was a big people's movement, it would say to the government, okay, all right, you bailed them out. That's a big favor you did to them. You borrowed from them to do it. That's another big favor you did for them. Enough big favors. Now you're going to tax them to deal with the debt that was built up because that's how you chose to bail them out. They don't want that. They want to be paid back the money they lent, and they do not want to be taxed, just like they didn't want to be taxed to deal with the crisis in the first place. How do you handle that situation? You announce the following: we in the United States have a terrible deficit. What? We borrowed so much. Notice the we again. We've borrowed so much money. If it strikes you a little strange because you didn't borrow anything, good. We've borrowed so much, we must deal with the problem. Good. You might think a rational person will say, okay, we got a big debt, we have to deal with it. Let's go raise the taxes to get the money to pay back the people we borrowed from because that'll reduce the debt. How about that? No. Can't do that. It has to be instead, here we go now, austerity. What does that mean? Less government spending. Let's make sure we all understand. If the government spends less on all the things it does, it'll have that money no longer needed to pay for, I'll pick something, Social Security, or Medicare, or Medicaid, or university scholarships, or highway maintenance, or you fill in the blank. All the money we don't spend on that, we can now use, you got it, to pay back the corporations and the rich from whom we borrowed the money to bail them out. If you notice a tone of frustration in my voice, I'm explaining how, to every audience I speak to, you included, I'm explaining the mechanism of how you have been repeatedly shafted while smiling. Something extraordinary is being done here. Austerity is a way of telling the population that the only way to deal with the deficit is to screw you out of one social support after another. Take it away. Take it away. Save money to pay off the corporations and the rich from whom the government borrowed in order to bail them out from the crisis they caused. Wow. Wow. That's what austerity means everywhere. Last week, Mr. Krugman wrote an article, good one, in which he excoriated, what was the title? He called his article, "The Plot Against France." Very dangerous in the United States to write championing France. You know, that France is awful, freedom fries, you remember all of that. So Paul Krugman says, this is really strange because France is in better shape than we are. So who the hell are we calling the French to account? They're in much better shape than we, and he goes through in details. Pretty well known. Why does he like France? A lot of very big lessons in there. He likes France because France is going easy on the austerity. They still do it, but mixing austerity with raising taxes on corporations and the rich. Ha ha. He celebrates what the French are doing as the kind of Keynesianism he wants, and he's right. But there's a deeper lesson. Because who administers the Keynesian program of France that Mr. Krugman admires, and rightly so? It's the Socialist Party. The French Socialist Party controls the presidency and both houses of parliament. It's a completely socialist government. Haven't been that way for half a century. Total dominance. And what is it the socialists do? Keynesian economics. That's what they do. A little bit of taxing of rich and the corporations, which has them screaming, and Krugman makes fun of that. Nicely done. Does it well. What's the lesson? Socialism in Europe has come to mean Keynesianism. Socialism means that the government intervenes to make capitalism work better. Socialism once meant you didn't like capitalism. You wanted something else. Not that you had come to a way of making it work better. That's a different project. In the long run, for socialism to become a way of making capitalism work better is socialism committing suicide, ending its role in the world, which it had for a long time, as an alternative to, as a critique of capitalism in the name of an alternative system. They're not doing that anymore. And I think you're going to see across Europe and beyond the steady decline and disappearance of the socialists as they blend into what would in this country be called the Democratic Party, because it too believes in government intervention to make capitalism work better. So of course Mr. Hollande and Mr. Obama have a lot to talk about. And in a peculiar irony, the Tea Party is right. Obama is a socialist. If by socialist you mean a Keynesian. He's not even that much of a Keynesian, but a little bit. So he's a little bit of a socialist in the sense that it is in Europe. It's remarkable. But austerity is as absurd as I've tried to portray it to you. All over Europe, the movement against austerity is extraordinarily powerful. There's more political activity in Europe, notwithstanding the absurd treatment of it in the American press when they treat it at all. There's more political activity critical of capitalism in Europe than there has been in 50 years. More general strikes, more street demonstration, more movements. A few weeks ago, the students in the economics department, that's where I pay attention, at Manchester University in Britain, walked out, denouncing their curriculum for not giving them exposure to alternative economic systems other than capitalism. That's a sign. That's an important sign. The opposition is enormous. Even here, the opposition is enormous, but it has a hard time in the United States being organized. So I want to say a few words about that. I've said it before, but clearly I'm not getting it across as well as I would like. I'm sure that's more than 50% my fault. Why is it that we are not well organized compared to so many other people in so many other parts of the world? Why do we have a minimum wage as miserable compared to all those countries I listed off for you? What happened here? Is it somehow that Americans are inherently uninterested in organization, afraid of it? No. That's an awful thing to suggest. That's a kind of an insult to the whole country, and I'm offended. There's historical reasons why. Let's review them so we all understand. Go back to what I said a few minutes ago. In the 1930s, what made Roosevelt change were not the good ideas of the predecessors of Mr. Krugman. Were not just Keynes's thoughts, Keynes's books, important as they were. It was organization. Powerful, well-organized Communist Party, Socialist parties, two of them, and the CIO. Well-organized. Let me say it again. Well-organized. And they changed everything. We had never had a Social Security system before. We got it. In the midst of a depression, when there was no money, we suddenly found the way to give every person over 65 years of age a check every month for the rest of their lives. Wow. In the midst of a depression when there was no money, we gave every unemployed person a check every week for a couple of years. In the midst of a depression when there was no money, we hired 15 million American unemployed and gave them federal jobs. Where did the money come from? Taxing the rich and the corporations. No mystery. And why did that happen? Because there were organizations that basically went to Roosevelt and said, you better do something, or we've got millions of people here who are going to be very angry, who are already in the streets. A few blocks from here, Union Square, was the center of demonstrations week after. Go to the archives of any New York City newspaper, you will see tens of thousands of people marching around Union Square to show what they wanted. And not only did the unions come and say, we want something, but right behind us are these socialists and communists, and you better deal with us because they're going to offer you a worse deal. They want to do what happened in Russia. Scary, scary. And Roosevelt understood. He was a good politician. These were millions of people, organized so they would vote in a certain way, organized so they would act in the streets in a certain way. So we got it. We got it. And that was part of the reason why we went into a war with Germany, allied with Joseph Stalin for 5 years. Now, if you're a businessman or woman, well, in those years, a businessman, and you're rich, and you don't like any of this, you're freaking out in the middle of the 1930s. Everything that's happening is impinging on your freedom of enterprise. You're being taxed like crazy. You're being regulated like crazy. Your money is being taken from you and given to black people. What could be worse? Think. No, I'm serious here. And you created in that part of the population, corporations and the rich, a horror of what happened. And when that was capped off by an alliance with the Soviet Union, your worst fantasy came through. All they have against Mr. Obama, besides his color, is that his father comes from someplace else, which is scary. But that's nothing compared to a Roosevelt who was arm in arm, giggling and smoking cigars with Joseph Stalin in one meeting after another, planning on how to organize the world after the war. Why do I tell you this? Because when the war was over, the business community of America and the rich knew exactly what had to be done. They had no illusion that the problem was Roosevelt. I mean, he had died, so literally he was gone. But it wasn't ideas that was the problem. They could take care of that. And it wasn't politicians. It was those organizations that had to be destroyed. And starting in the late 1940s, that was done. First, the Communist Party was transformed from a political powerhouse organization organized across the country into an espionage association for the Soviet Union. You demonize them as spies, and you eradicate them in every way that that kind of demonization makes possible. As soon as that job is done, you declare to the American people that socialists is just another way of spelling communist. I've always wondered, as I was a teacher in the United States, why is it that my students, basically in most of my courses, found the following words to be synonyms: communist, Marxist, socialist, anarchist, terrorist, Muslim. Well, the Muslim is more recent. Before, the Muslim wasn't in there, but you get the picture. They're all the same. Why? I used to wonder, what is this? Every European understands the difference between communist and socialist. What is this? It's not a flaw. It's not stupidity. None of that. It's because we were put through the ringer in this society to destroy first the communists, then equate the socialists with the communists, and when you got rid of them, then go after the labor movement, which has been in a 50-year decline because it has been under the same kind of assault. Over those 50 years, you taught, in a very profound emotional way, you taught Americans to be really suspicious of any organization, particularly anyone that smells lefty in some way. And that would be a rational approach for an American, watching, as all Americans did, these people being deported, jailed, ostracized, lose their jobs, lose their homes, destroy their families. Even watch the two Rosenbergs get executed and all the rest. No, it's very powerful imagery, lasting for decades. So of course we're not really well organized. The left has been decimated here. There's a horrible irony. It's precisely because the United States didn't carry out a mass execution. It worked this same kind of process, but without physical destruction. It worked on the mind. It worked on the anxiety. It worked on the mentality. And that's why it's so hard for Americans to kind of get it together, to overcome the anxieties of their individuality, to make an organization with other people, to have the power of numbers and the power of organization. We're learning. We'll relearn. That's like people who've lost the ability to walk, they learn again. Occupy Wall Street was an important step, learning these things. Very important step. But can't expect that kind of a 50-year thing to be overcome by one surging movement. It's going to have to find its way to do it again. But it's not that we don't have the capacity to organize. It's that we have a history to overcome. That's true of every people, and that's our history, and that's what we have to face in order to make. But if we did, then I think it would be easy for folks like me to explain what austerity is in such a way that the people of this country would never permit this kind of stuff to continue. They just wouldn't. Let me turn then, because we talk mostly about the federal government, now to the state government. And here there's a report. I don't have the time, but those of you that have a moment, there's a very interesting left-of-center research, economic research outfit in Washington. And while I have my disagreements with them, they do good work. They're called the Economic Policy Institute, EPI.org. And all the work they do is available for free at that website. And they recently issued a report. It's called An Attack on American Labor Standards by a professor of labor economics. I believe he's at the University of Oregon, out on the West Coast, named Gordon Laffer, L-A-F-E-R. So if you have a chance to look up the work of Gordon Laffer, and particularly this recent report just a few days ago, Attack on American Labor Standards. Here's his point. While we've all been focused on the federal government, at the level of the state government, extraordinary things have been going on that are just as important in this process of breaking down the standard of living of the American worker, solving the problems of capitalism off of the backs of the average people, whether it's cutting Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid or any of the other things that are being used to provide the funds to pay off the corporations and the rich for lending the money to the government to bail them out. I just gave you that story. All these cutbacks. He says the same thing is going on at the state and local levels. And I'm going to just read you a few of the examples that he brings up. They're remarkable. In New Hampshire, legislators recently repealed the state's minimum wage. They repealed it, overriding the governor's veto, even though the state already had the lowest minimum wage in New England. New Hampshire. Idaho passed a law allowing children as young as 12 to work for up to 10 hours a week cleaning and performing manual labor at their schools. 12-year-olds. 12 years old. Under a new Tennessee law, laid-off employees collecting unemployment can only wait 13 weeks for a job that pays the same as their previous position. After 13 weeks, they have to accept any job that pays at least 75% of their previous wage, or else they don't get any more unemployment. And the cutoff drops to 70% after 25 weeks and 65% after 38 weeks. In Wisconsin, the legislature not only prohibited localities from establishing sick leave standards, but also retroactively abolished the right to sick leave that was established in Milwaukee in 2008. There's a long, long list. Here, in a nutshell, is what is happening. One of the delayed effects of this economic crisis, with its millions of unemployed and its abandoned houses as people are foreclosed out of their homes, is that the tax revenues of cities and towns and states diminishes. Unemployed people don't pay income tax. Unemployed people buy much less, and so they pay less in sales tax. People who abandon their homes stop paying their property tax, etc. So all the revenue streams coming in. At the same time, the federal government's difficulties mean they can help states and localities less than they did before. So whichever way you look at it, less money for the state and local governments. So what are they going to do? They're in the same boat. They can either tax the corporations and the rich to make up what they're not getting from everybody else, or they can cut social supports and programs and expenditures. In the state of Idaho, they're going to be saving several $million a year paying workers who were cleaning the schools, laying them off, and using instead children as young as 12 years of age. You live in this society. You live here where this is a solution to the problem. Today's New York Times, which really should know better, has a front page story by their labor reporter, Stephen Greenhouse. It's about the de Blasio government's problem, the new government coming in. What's the problem? For those of you that haven't been paying attention, it's a perfect microcosm. It turns out that in the labor negotiations between Mayor Bloomberg and the 300,000 city workers, that over the last several years, they have been unable to come to contract agreements. They are all working under their old contracts, expired contracts, because they couldn't reach a new one. Basically, the Bloomberg administration said to them, we'll give you a new contract, but it will entail a wage freeze, in other words, no increase, and you're going to have to pay more into your medical coverage program. The unions decided this was not a very attractive proposition, And so under existing law, if you don't negotiate a new contract, the old one continues. And the old one gave them the same money without having to pay more for medical, so that was clearly the better choice. So we're now 4 years later. 300,000 people have not gotten a wage increase for 4 years. Meanwhile, prices rise every year, a couple percent, which means your real take-home value of what you're paying is shrinking every year. And the city unions have served notice that they are expecting from the new mayor the retroactive catch-up that they are owed for 4 years of no wage increase at all. And this is going to cost Mr. de Blasio $7 to $10 billion, which he doesn't have. So what's going to happen? Mr. de Blasio basically has the same choice. Same choice. He can either go and tax the corporations and the rich, or he can say to the unions, which he said in his last public televised speech before the election, I'd love to give them a wage increase, but they'd have to show me the cost savings elsewhere. That is political speak for I'll give them more, but I got to take it away from somebody else. So maybe the subways will become even dirtier than they already are. And maybe the only way to get a seat on the next subway train is to shoo the rats off, having moved up from below into the seats themselves because they are more comfortable. I don't know. But Mr. de Blasio is going to be twisting in that same wind. The terrible thing about the article by Stephen Greenhouse is there's not a word about taxing anybody. The whole article is about he's either going to give these workers their retroactive pay and take it away from somebody else, or he's not. But the idea that the city doesn't have to reduce expenditures over here in order to make an expenditure over there, it can make an expenditure over there and tax somebody more, doesn't enter the article. It's as if this option vanished. It's amazing how a culture can block itself from solving a problem because it's politically unpalatable. Final thing for today, taxes. Let's talk a little bit about taxes, whether it's the city of New York, whether it's the state of New York, whether it's the federal government. This is going to be fast, but I have to drive this stuff home because so often the understanding of this gets confused. Okay, first, the federal government. The federal government of the United States basically has two ways that it raises most of the money. It's not complicated. One thing is an income tax. You all know that. The money is withheld from your checks. Income tax. And the second thing is what's called a payroll tax. That's also withheld from your check. It's a separate category on your check, but it's withheld. The income tax is exactly what it says. It taxes your income depending on how much income you get. The first 10,000 are taxed at one rate, the next 10,000 are taxed at a slightly higher rate, and so on. The top rate in the income tax, by the way, it's about 50-50. About half the money the government gets comes from the income tax, and half the government gets is from the payroll tax, roughly. The income tax is progressive. The higher your income, the higher the percentage of it you pay. So those who get more pay a higher percentage. In the 1950s and 60s, the top rate that the richest people paid was 91%. That means for every dollar over around, 100,000, every dollar you earned over 100,000 in the 50s and 60s, you had to give Uncle Sam 91 cents and you got to keep 10. Republicans did that and Democrats. Kennedy did it, Eisenhower did it, they all did it. And the Congress voted for it. Why? Because we had been through a Great Depression and a war, and everybody should help rebuild our economy. The rich should pay what they're capable of. That's what they all said. Republicans too. 91% in the 50s and 60s, 70% in the 1970s. What's the top rate today? 39.6%. Do you understand? The income tax has come down for rich people drastically in the last 30 or 40 years. They have had a dramatic tax cut. You haven't. They have, you haven't. The government doesn't have enough money to spend because it doesn't tax rich people the way it used to. If it did, it would. But it didn't, so it doesn't, and you can't. See, that's how it works. That's for half. What's the other half of the federal government's money? The payroll tax. Let's look at that. The payroll tax pays for Social Security, Medicare. Those are the two things. Money is withheld from your paycheck, and your employer matches that amount, dollar for dollar, and it goes into an account that's basically a governmental pension. But you pay in, and when your union or whoever you negotiate, however your salary is determined, the employer figures that out. That's part of what he knows is his cost of employing you. His part of putting into that account, plus withholding from your pay an equivalent amount. That's how it's done. How is the payroll tax organized? Is it progressive like the income tax? No, it's not progressive. It is the opposite, called regressive. What does that mean? The higher your income, ready, the less of a percentage you pay. Here's how it works. For the first $113,000 that you earn, everybody pays the same. Let me do that again. Everybody, if you earn $10,000 or $50 or $80 or $113, you pay the same percentage for your payroll tax. On every dollar over $113,000 a year that you earn, your payroll tax is zero, nada, zilch, nothing. So if you earn $1 million, you pay the same payroll tax as a person who earns $113,000. You with me? In other words, the richer you are, the smaller the percentage you pay to the pay. It is the opposite of progressive. Is that necessary? No. Is that arrangement written in the Bible? No. In the Quran? No. Nowhere. That's just a decision of politicians. Could it be otherwise? Of course. Let me give you some examples. The payroll tax does not apply to your non-labor income, just to your wage and salary. So, for example, if you get millions of dollars in interest because you have money that you lend, how much payroll tax do you pay on the interest? Nothing. If you get a lot of dividends, how much payroll tax on that? Nothing. Get a lot of rent? Nothing. You with me? Who gets the bulk of income from interest, dividends, and rent? You guessed it. Rich people, who therefore don't pay anything on the payroll tax. Does it have to be that way? No. You want to solve Social Security problem in 5 minutes? Apply it to the income from dividends, interest, and rent. Here's another suggestion. Why stop at 113? Keep right on going. Why don't you go forever? How? You earn 30 million? Or you're like Bill Gates, you earn billions? Good. Good, you get to pay a lot. No higher percentage than anybody else. So a poor person living in I don't know where pays the same percentage as Bill Gates if he had to pay on all of his income. But we don't ask that. Why not? Because Bill Gates doesn't want to. That's about it. And people like him don't. That's how we organize our taxes. There's a problem in Social Security and Medicare? You got to be kidding. There's no problem. We don't tax all kinds of people in all kinds of ways. That's why there's not enough money. But it's not that there isn't the money there. It's true, if we tax them, then the Paul Newman Daytona watch might have to go for just $200,000 instead of 1.1 million. It's true. They couldn't bid the way they did before because they'd be funding, I don't know, 1 million older folks. And that's clear. We don't want the million older folks. We want Christie's to be in that elegant building where they are located. State level. How do states raise money? Well, one of the most interesting things that states do that neither the federal government nor most cities do is they have an expenditure tax, usually called a sales tax. You all know that. You here live in New York City, which is unusual because you pay a state sales tax and on top of it a city sales tax. But the overwhelming majority of cities in America do not have their own sales tax. So in most states in the United States, you pay just a sales tax. But a sales tax is also regressive. Why? Because John D. Rockefeller, who rushes into TJ Maxx on sale day in the basement and wrestles other people for the same pair of underpants, when he gets it and you lose it, he has to pay the same sales tax you do. In other words, his 18 cents on that $2 pair, he pays the same sales tax you do. It does not make any discrimination according to your ability to pay, the way an income tax does. It's regressive. The same tax for a rich person is inconsequential, and for a poor person is massive. So a sales tax is not geared to taking from people according to their capacity to pay. The very principle that governs the income tax is excluded when it comes to the states. That's why the more progressive states do have not only a sales tax, but also an income tax to try to offset that a little. And now we come to the last one, and then we're done for today. The property tax. We have a very peculiar country because the federal government relies on income and payroll tax, state governments particularly on sales taxes. Of course, the state governments also have all those fees. Those are regressive too. So if you're a millionaire, you pay the same for your driving license as if you're a poor person. Very interesting idea. Why? Why? Pay the same rate if you have a Maserati as if you have a 10-year-old Datsun, et cetera, et cetera. Same rate. Does it have to be that way? No, of course not. Could be progressive. Out of the question. So we have local government that doesn't depend on income tax, with a few exceptions like New York, and doesn't depend on sales tax, again with a few exceptions like New York. If you live in New York, you really are whacked with taxes. But then again, you have New York. What do most localities depend on? The property tax. Very interesting. Here we're not taxing income, that is, the government isn't taxing the money that comes into you the way the federal government does. It gets you when you get your check, the money's pulled out. Your income is taxed. In the case of the sales, it's not your income that's taxed, it's your act of spending the income that gets taxed. That's why it's so wonderful for rich people, because if you're rich enough, you don't spend all your income. You save it. And when you save it, you don't have to pay a sales tax because you're not spending it. Poor people have to spend all their money and get hit with the sales tax. Sales tax is a very unfair tax. But the property tax beats them all. How does it work? In every city and town, there's a tax assessor's office. Look in your local community, you'll find it in your city hall. The job of the tax assessor is to figure out what the value is of the property that's going to be taxed. Notice, a property tax does not tax your income, and it doesn't tax your spending. It taxes what you own, your property. And each year you have to pay a certain amount of percentage on the value of the property you own. That's what a property tax means. And that's how cities and towns live. Now, you might think they tax all property, but they don't. They tax land, buildings, automobiles. Those are the three things, big ones. Do that again. Land, buildings like homes and stores and factories, and vehicles. Those are taxed. What is not taxed? Stocks, bonds, cash. Oh my. Oh my. What does that mean? It means a fundamental indecency is performed on you, and you're not even aware of it. Most Americans have no property, taxable property. They live in a rented apartment. They don't own the land. They don't own the building. They don't have a car. That's it. They don't directly pay a property tax. Those Americans who have a little bit of property have a car, and if you have a little bit more, a home, a condo, a co-op, a self-standing house. So you get to pay tax on the car and the house. Only a tiny fraction of Americans have an appreciable amount of property in the form of stocks and bonds. Who are they? They have a technical name, the rich. And on their property, get ready now, there is no property tax. Do you understand? Nobody taxes the value of the property in stocks and bonds. If I have a $100,000 house anywhere, I pay a property tax on that house to the community in which the house is located. If I sell the house and use the $100,000 and buy $100,000 worth of stock, I have the same property, but my property tax bill is zero. Nobody taxes that. Why? Is that written in the Bible? No. In the Quran? No. No place is it written. Indeed, early in American history, one of the few kinds of property that was taxed in many of the colonial states were stocks and bonds. So we even have the precedent in the United States to do it. First tax ever levied in Connecticut was on bonds in a canal connecting New Haven and Hartford. So sometime 150 years ago, we got rid of the property tax on stocks and bonds, meaning that those people rich enough to hold a significant portion of their property in the form of stocks and bonds pay no tax by doing that. No matter how rich they are, if you own $1 billion worth of Microsoft shares, you pay no tax on the property. If you get income, say by dividends, you have to pay an income tax, but you don't pay on the property. If you have a house that pays you rental because you rent out rooms, you have to pay an income tax on the rental you get and a property tax on the value of the house. You own shares, you pay an income tax on the dividends, you pay no tax on the property. You want to solve America's fiscal problem in 10 seconds? Levy a property tax. 0.001% of the value of stocks and bonds on the ownership of them. And the government will be awash in money, will be able to stimulate the economy, get us out of the crisis, and not have to borrow a nickel. And who will it be taxing? The people it would otherwise borrow the money from. And we're back to where we began. Federal taxes can and should be made much more just. State taxes can and should be made much more just. And property taxes can and should be made. Last point for today. When I explain this, whether it's on the radio or television or in talks like this, often the following question comes to me, and I thought it would be a good way to end today. Gee, if we did that, won't the companies just leave? Won't the rich people just move their assets? If Rhode Island decides to tax stocks and bonds, all the people in Rhode Island who have them will set up an account in North Carolina, move the stocks there, and end of the story. I always love this sort of thing because it sounds, when you ask the question, as though the government does something, the private person evades it, end of the story. But that's never the end of the story. The government isn't passive. The government isn't handcuffed. If you try to cheat the government out of what it wants, the government has an extraordinary array of mechanisms to get at you. So what do you mean you will leave Rhode Island than go to North Carolina. No problem. We'll make the property tax on stocks and bonds a federal law. You can go to any state you want. You're liable. We'll leave the country. Oh, you will you? How nice. We're going to track your income for the last 10 years. If suddenly your assets are generating a whole hell of a lot less money this year than last, we're going to suspect that you probably moved it. And so we're going to go look at your bank account, and we're going to see if there was a transfer. And if it turns out that something extraordinary has drawn you to the island of the Bahamas 12 times last year, we're going to make a deal with the government of the Bahamas that for every nickel we don't tax you, they will. And of course the government in Bahamas could refuse, and we will then tell the government of Bahamas what kind of thing we tell the governments in Iraq and Afghanistan. Either you do what we say or we will sink you. And the Bahamas are not in a position to mess around with the United States government. So does the United States government have ways of making sure that you can't evade it? Of course it does. Will it do that? No. Of course it won't. Of course it won't. But that's for the same reason that the tax system looks the way I just described it to you. That is the problem, and an organized mass of people would be able to make sure that none of it. But don't ever believe that there's a technical difficulty in the government going and finding the money. That's not a problem. The worst that you could say is it'll take a little time because people are ingenious in hiding their money. For many years, people hid money in Switzerland. And then a few years ago, for a whole host of reasons, the United States and Switzerland sat down, and the United States said to Switzerland, this has got to stop. And the Swiss said, no, we've been this way for 400 years. And the United States said, this has got to stop. No, it stopped. It stopped. You can't do it anymore. You can't hide your accounts in Switzerland. You can't do it. Can't do it. And do you think that the Cayman Islands or Luxembourg or Cyprus or all the other places where these games are played, that the governments don't know? They all know. Could they do something? Of course they could do something. Of course they could do something. Much more money is involved in this game than anything that the pirates in Somalia are doing. We make a big deal about the pirates in Somalia. Those are pikers by comparison to what we're talking about. Every major international bank, I believe without exception, has either been or is in the process of being approached by the United States government to pay huge fines over the last year and a half. I'm talking Chase Manhattan, First Citibank, HSBC, all of them. They're paying for fees they charge beyond what they should have, for manipulating the interest rates, LIBOR in England, for now manipulating the foreign exchange markets. They just come into trouble with that, for money laundering, for all of it. This has been going on for 50 years. Now, because of the crisis and because of popular anger at banks, suddenly it turns out that the government can prosecute and get billion-dollar fines. Gee, imagine that. And if the government wanted to make sure that nobody evades their share of taxes, you don't think it could do it? You don't understand. You really don't. Okay, bottom line. I hope this was interesting. I hope you feel a sense of understanding this stuff better. But most of all, I do hope, my honest opinion, that you channel whatever upset or anger any of this has produced and make a contribution to building the kinds of organizations that can make a difference, as they have in the past, and without which we will all just be spectators, however enjoyable it is to understand all of this, spectators in a fleecing of the people of the world that is stupefying. Last point. I had a conversation a couple of days ago with a person who works at the United Nations. And she was telling me about a UNICEF program these days that's focused on sanitation. And what she said to me was the following, that about 1/3 of the people of the world have no toilet. I don't know how else to get across why the capitalist system that is now governing the world has lost its claim on our loyalty. But to have the sale of a Paul Newman Daytona watch for $1.1 million, while 1/3 of the people of the world can't get a toilet, tells you something about a system that isn't working real well. It used to be strange, rare, and scary to talk critically about capitalism. It isn't anymore. The window for that kind of thing is now wide open. It would be a real shame if those of us who always wished for that window to be open missed the chance to jump through it and see what remarkable possibilities are now available. We've run out of time. I've kept you late. We will be in this room, unless you hear otherwise from us, in December, and I hope you will join us again then.